Welcome to episode 30 of the Everyday Sens podcast. I'm Jack Richardson, joined by Brennan Parks. Brennan, it's episode 30. It's been 30 of these that we've done. It's kind of a nice little internal milestone, let's say. Again, if you are here on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. We're trying to hit that before training camp. I think we're going to do it. In the dog days of August here, we're doing comparisons against other teams that the Sens are stacking up against, not necessarily the Atlantic. Some big moves happening in the Eastern Conference. I guess we could touch a little bit on Erik Karlsson and the Penguins a little bit. We didn't have a chance to talk about that. But before we get into that, how are you doing on this Tuesday, August 8th? We're doing a Tuesday drop today because of the long weekend. So how was your weekend, Brendan?
It was good. Yeah, I mean, I've got 2 more days here until I'm moving to Edmonton. So a little bit of personal news on that. But that's nice for me. You know why? Because they're 2 hours behind there. So the Sens games are going to start at 5 most nights, which I love because then they're going to be done at like 8 o'clock and I can produce some more content. I'll be up for pods after the game. You'll be dead tired. So yeah, it'll be nice. But otherwise, I mean, I don't think we're going to hit the hour mark today. Maybe we'll push it somehow. But yeah, we've been hitting that consistently. But right now, man, there's been nothing Sens related. Still waiting on that Pinto contract and the Sokolov notably. So those should happen at some point. Hopefully we don't get into like a holdout nerve-wracking situation where we're like into training camp and Pinto's not signed. That would be super unfortunate. And like I said before, I'm hoping Pierre did his research and kind of talked to Shane and was like, yeah, we're going to sign Tarasenko to $5 million, but like you're on board with this, right? Like you're going to be able to still sign with us. You're not going to hold out. But yeah, I mean, otherwise still going to be writing articles, still going to be producing these pods as much as we can. We're going to do a members pod tomorrow. So look for that. Obviously the first bit of that will be free as well to everybody. So yeah, we can get in. I do want to talk about the Karlsson thing a little bit. I want to get your take on that. I know a lot of people were sour. That was a huge deal. That was a bigger trade than I've seen in some time. Like not even the Sens trade was that big with 3 teams. So yeah, what were your thoughts on that? I bet you were pretty upset about that, weren't you?
Yeah, I was. There were so many moving parts though too, right? I mean, it's crazy that we literally pressed record. We were going to record, and then I just thought of it like, oh yeah, we should definitely talk about this. It's a huge deal. Excuse me. We will be comparing the Ottawa Senators to the Florida Panthers. That's the team we've chosen for this episode. So we're not going to talk about the Penguins in depth yet and how they stack up in the East and all that. We will though, especially with this move. Yeah, it's not ideal, I would say. I think for my Sens fandom, because I look, obviously I want Erik Karlsson to succeed. I think him winning a cup, Mark Stone just did it. I think if Karlsson could at some point in his career, it'd be great. But the Penguins are the source of a lot of pain for Sens fans over the years. 2008, they got knocked out of the playoffs, 2013 and 2017. So just bookended every 4 or 5 years, 3 times the Penguins ended any Sens playoff hopes. And that's not nothing. That's a lot. Enough to create a rivalry and, disdain for one franchise. And look, having Karlsson have his best year. I know last year he won the Norris again, 100 points and all that. I think Sens fans are aware that 2017 playoff run was outstanding for any player. It was a very unique playoff performance on one leg from Karlsson. The fact that ended with the Penguins in that double overtime game in Game 7, and then everything fell off after that for the Sens. Like, it's weird. It's a weird feeling. The other wrinkle to me is, look, I don't know if it was rumored he was linked. Kyle Dubas was linked to Ottawa as well as Pittsburgh, and it wasn't nothing. He might be waiting on this ownership situation. I think the dragged out process made Dubas have to decide and just take Pittsburgh because it was an offer. He could have been the president of hockey ops and the general manager in Ottawa, right? I mean, so again, there's another cog there. And look, not to say that he would have found a way to get Erik Karlsson to Ottawa, because we make our jokes. It would have been great to see him here. I don't think he would have fit. So that's not what this is about. It's more just about the nostalgic fan in me, and also that the Eastern Conference keeps just loading up. And I tweeted it out that there are multiple playoff caliber teams in this conference. There's probably 3 or 4, maybe just 3 that should not have a realistic hope of making the playoffs. But the rest do. And that's scary if you're a team that needs to make it next year like the Sens. So what were your thoughts on the trade? The trade itself was crazy, though. It was 9 players. Somehow the Penguins saved cap space with this deal. Like, what a trade for Kyle Dubas.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff Petrie went back to Montreal. They traded Mike Hoffman again. He another Sen on the move. He's just been tossed around. Like nobody is keeping Hoffman long term at this point. I couldn't believe the amount of players. If we go back to the Karlsson trade originally, let me see if I can pull this off the top of my head. So Ottawa ended up getting Stützle, Norris, Ostapchuk, Marilainen, and there might have been one other. Sogard. Yeah, those were all from the trade tree, which is insane.
Yeah, like DeMello turned into the pick that they used for Marilainen, and like I think they traded 2 picks to trade up to draft Sogard in 2019. So all those players are because of the Karlsson trade. It's crazy.
And that trade is really Pierre Dorion's saving grace. Like, he probably wouldn't be here if that trade didn't work out the way it was, just because, like, you see Tim Stützle is probably the most important player on the Sens. I think he's solidifying himself as, like, he's a number 1 center, right? And you got him from that deal. And again, like, that was the Sharks pick. That boosted up in the lottery to 3rd overall. So if like, the Sharks were expected to be, I think they were a playoff team the year before or 2 years before, and they were expected to be a playoff contender, and then they just collapsed sort of like Ottawa did, and Ottawa got super lucky. Like, listen, Pierre, I applaud you for that trade now, but at the same time, when that trade was made, people were angry. Like, people did not think, and there was no way that they thought that San Jose was going to collapse either. That was kind of a lucky thing that happened, but regardless, I've got this little picture of Erik pulled up. If you want to be tortured, just look on YouTube right now, because I've got this jersey swap for Erik Karlsson in Pittsburgh, and it looks just horrible. So like you said, I think it's kind of funny seeing him in Pittsburgh, considering they ruined our franchise for 6 years. But the biggest thing to me is the Eastern Conference, and we're going to dive into every team like we've talked about, or most teams. But like, Pittsburgh, in my mind, was kind of a lost cause. Like, I know they have Crosby, I know they still have Malkin, they have Letang, they have these guys, but they're old. Like, they're an older team. They're kind of like Boston in the sense, and with Pittsburgh, you've already seen it. Like, they're regressing, right? They regressed this past year. Did they make the playoffs? No way. Or no, they missed. So, you've got all these good star players, but at the same time, they're well past their prime. Adding Karlsson, who just had a 100-point season, and he's a Norris winner like three times now. Like, that's, man, I mean, really? Like, I was angry just for the fact that Ottawa now has so much more competition, because I think, and we'll talk about the makeshift of their team, but I think that, like, adding him, that really puts them at least a couple steps ahead. You know what I mean? Like, that puts them on the next tier up. I did not project them as a playoff team, and now I'm second guessing because you've added just a literal game changer. So, don't like that, but at the same time, I mean, we can be optimistic and say it's going to be fun to watch the bloodbath in the East this season. That's going to be my optimistic take. My pessimistic is that this just got a whole lot harder for the Sens to potentially make the playoffs and end their 6-year drought, right? So,
yeah, and the other reason I don't like it is because whenever the Sharks and Sens would play, there weren't super important implications, right? It's an East and West team. It was nice that he was out there. It doesn't really matter seeing him do well. But now that he's in Pittsburgh, like, we have to cheer against him, because we're going to talk about the Florida Panthers, but this is a team that's competing with Ottawa for a spot, and not that anything's a lock going into the year, but it wouldn't be surprising if this is one of the teams that ends up being a wild card, hopeful or whatever. So it's that part of it. I want to talk a little bit. I made a little headline here for the YouTube. Let's revisit a little bit the original Karlsson trade, because like, a lot of moving parts for the Penguins and Sharks and the Habs, a 3-team trade, and Pittsburgh gets rid of. I read a Penguins fan talking about how Dubas in one trade just added an elite player in the league and got rid of every mistake that the previous GM had made, which is crazy to think about. But aside from that, if you just look at what there's some kind of multiverse somewhere where the Sens don't trade Karlsson, and you were kind of reminiscing there on the Sharks timeline and how that all worked. This is how it was. It was in the training camp of 2018, the Sens trade Karlsson, right? Big deal. A lot of draft picks, because obviously a lot of those players we named are guys that the Sens drafted. And honestly, like, Chris Tierney, Josh Norris, and Dylan DeMello were the names that came back in that deal. The rest were draft picks. Like, the Stützle pick ended up being 3rd overall in 2020. So the Sharks, that first season with Karlsson, go on this run to the Eastern Conference Final in 2019. They made the Eastern Conference Final that year. Signed Karlsson to a massive extension, the 11.5 for 8 years. Like, it's a crazy contract, and he's worth it, don't get me wrong, but a very, very heavy payday. They come in the next season and just tank, and they absolutely tank. They could not win. I remember distinctly every day I'll admit it, and any Sens fan who kind of gets on me for this can hindsight's 2020, whatever. I was cheering for the Sens to lose that year because it was their tank year. And then I'm checking every day to see if the Sharks lost, and they kept losing. And quite honestly, that's the year that got cut short from COVID, right? Because COVID happened in March of 2020. 10 games didn't get played. I think I'm not making an assumption here, but like, if that season gets played out, maybe the Sharks make their standing better, and that doesn't end up being the third overall pick. The lottery was, I believe it was Detroit who was first, had the first overall odds. Ottawa was second, and then Ottawa again at third with San Jose's pick. And their San Jose pick ended up staying in third, which got them Tim Stützle. Second overall dropped to fifth overall, which was Jake Sanderson. It's crazy thinking about all that just over 3 years later. And it's crazy again that Karlsson gets traded because, yeah, the Karlsson trade, I think when they made the trade, I remember the tweet from the team was most important trade in the rebuild, and everyone, heads were exploding because it was ridiculous. They just traded a, the best player, the best defenseman in the league for what seemed like pennies on the dollar. But it's crazy looking at it 3 years later. Like this is the most important trade in the rebuild. They weren't kidding. And for a team that struggles with PR and everything, it was a very interesting stance to take, and it worked out. The thing about Dorion is, yeah, it's a saving grace for sure. And I'm not even prepared. Like, I know a lot of people talk about this too, but can you give him credit for that trade? Or this is a half balance thing, right? Like if it hadn't worked out, if it hadn't worked out, then they wouldn't be able to, you can't say that it was a good trade, obviously, but you could detract from Dorion. But since it did work out, a lot of it was luck because no one was planning on the Sharks tanking that season. It just really worked out for them. I think it was good karma for the Duchesne trade and how that turned out to Ottawa losing a lottery pick in 2019. They just got 2 in 2020 instead. So what were your, I guess, if you can remember, it was 5 years ago that Karlsson was traded from Ottawa. And if you can rack your memory a little bit, like what was your initial thoughts at the time, and obviously how it's turned out now with not just Tim Stützle, but Josh Norris too, who's also a first line caliber center. It's unprecedented.
Yeah, it is. And I don't even think I was on Twitter at the time that this happened. I think I joined Twitter in like 2019, 2020. But yeah, so I did not like the trade, as most people didn't when it first came in, because like the trade, I have it up. It was Chris Tierney, Rudolph Balcers, Dylan DeMello, Josh Norris, a first round pick in 2019 or 2020. So we didn't even know at the time, and then a second round pick in 2019 and 2 conditional draft picks. So that was a lot of quantity, right? And of course they got a lot of pieces, and that was kind of the good side, was okay, we have some pieces for the rebuild now at least, but it didn't feel like a lot of quality because even at the time, Norris was a 19th overall pick, I want to say, and he wasn't touted as like a first line guy. When they got him, he was, I think even in the, when Dorion talked about it, I'm pretty sure he referred to him as a third line center, or somebody
that
did.
Was Trent. It was Trent Mann. It was Trent Mann who said we didn't know he had this potential.
Yeah, they were like, we thought he was going to be a third line center. So that just kind of tells you too that they got lucky because he eclipsed what they had projected him as for development. Because if Josh Norris was a third line center and that first round pick that was third overall was where it was expected to be, which was probably in at least the middle of the first round or near 20th overall, whatever it was, if you don't get Stützle there and you get a prospect who's another third line guy, for example, I don't think Dorion's still here. I think he would have been fired because the rebuild would be delayed. If you don't have number 18 right now in Ottawa, the rebuild would not be where it's at right now. I can assure you of that. It would be well behind and kind of off the rails. So they got lucky with that, and I think that was kind of a saving grace because Dorion has made some other pretty questionable moves, and people will let you know that, Sens fans in Ottawa. But this move, you can always go back and look at it and say, they've got 5 of their most key pieces right now in the organization from that trade. And of course, DeMello was flipped. It wasn't right from that trade, but again, that's all from Pierre Dorion's work. So, and hey, I liked Rudolph Balcers too. I still think they should have brought him back. He was one of my favorites, and he got pushed aside. I think he's out of the league now too. But yeah, overall, I think it sucks to see Karlsson in Pittsburgh. But I'm still happy with the return he got. I was okay with trading him at the time too. I didn't I would have been fine if they signed him, but again, I think the rebuild would be, I don't even know where it would be right now if they didn't trade Karlsson. It's just too important of a piece. They'd be strapped with that $11.5 million contract. Maybe they move him for the pieces. I didn't like what San Jose got. I know they were just dumping his salary mostly, but they didn't really get that much quality. I didn't think in this trade. It was kind of just we're trading the best defenseman in the league because we don't want to pay him. So for Ottawa, that would have kind of sucked if that ended up being the case. But yeah, overall, Erik Karlsson is still paying dividends. He's going to be paying dividends to Ottawa for the next, at least 7-8 years as they've got Stützle and Norris locked up here. But yeah, those are kind of my thoughts, and I'm going to hate watching him in Pittsburgh. I'm going to hate rooting against him because I won't root for the Penguins, and I will not root for, especially now that Ottawa's going to be competing with them. You could see a situation at the end of this year with how much of a bloodbath this is, where Ottawa is fighting right with Pittsburgh until the end to get a playoff berth. Like, that's just the reality of it, right? So it's going to suck, but yeah, those are kind of my thoughts on it. And if you've got anything else, go for it.
That's pretty much it. And I'm not looking forward to the games against Pittsburgh, the games in Pittsburgh when they're here. Like it's if anyone has been to a Sens and Penguins game in the last 15 years, it's full of Crosby fans, which makes sense. He's one of those players that just makes fans. I mean, one of my good friends is a Penguins fan, and he has no reason, no tie to Pittsburgh. It's just because when he was a kid, he liked Crosby. Now he's here and he's talking, oh, we got Karlsson, we're, whatever. And my head wants, like, I want to explode, it sucks. But that being said, we just pulled a segment out of thin air, and that's what we do here. I know it might be weird that we're kind of not complaining, but this is the dog days of summer. Nothing happens in August in the NHL. This trade obviously just happened in August, but it's usually very quiet. There's nothing happening for the Sens. And like you mentioned, Pinto, Sokolov need new deals, but a lot of RFAs in the league do as well. Like Zegras is still a big one that hasn't been done. So we will slowly wait for all that to come out. But in the meantime, we are going to compare the Ottawa Senators to the Florida Panthers. Now, if anyone missed episode 29, we did this with the Buffalo Sabres. And basically what we do, use Cap Friendly's depth chart page, and they're I'd say 75% accurate in terms of what the lines were. I think they have a science to how they do it. I don't know if it's just organized by highest paid, whatever it is, but it's usually fairly accurate. So we're going to do the same thing today. We're going to go line by line. We have our own, first line in Ottawa's head. It's Tkachuk, Stützle, and Giroux, and so forth, or whatever. We'll see how it slots afterwards, but most teams' depth charts are set right now. So we are going to use August as that month to do that. So the Florida Panthers, Brendan, obviously this team went on quite the run. These two teams were tied at the trade deadline, let's say, and then went in two different directions. Florida got hot, made the playoffs on a whim, actually, and then the Sens missed. But then the Panthers went on and beat the Boston Bruins in 7, came back from 3-1 down. Then they beat the Toronto Maple Leafs in 5 games, sweep the Carolina Hurricanes, and those were, I believe, 3 of the 4 best teams in the NHL. And then they lose to Vegas in the Stanley Cup Finals, obviously. So quite the run from Florida. It was very impressive. Was not a fluke where they got lucky with matchups. They beat the best teams in the league. So they went on a run. So let's compare the rosters, because they did take a bit of a hit this summer. Did not improve. Definitely not. Like, I don't think anyone can argue that. So let's compare, because I think these two teams were very, very close last year as it is. So I'm curious just to see what we go in with. And we're kind of going in cold. Like, we kind of glanced at the lines, but when we go line by line, D pair by D pair, goalie by goalie, could be a different answer. So let's pull that up right now, and you can start us off here.
For sure, yeah. So we can just look at this Cap Friendly again. And I just want to, again, preface this by saying that we aren't like pros in Florida Panther scouts here. I don't have, like, I remember last episode with Casey Middlestad, I totally thought that guy was a bust. And then I looked and he had a 60-point season. So I don't have like firm understandings of where every player in their lineup is development-wise. But this lineup is fairly accurate. I've looked at some of what the Panthers fans say. When we get to the defense, it's going to be a little bit different than what you're seeing on the screen. Again, if you're not on YouTube, you won't see this. We're going to try to verbalize it, but if you want to, you can go on Cap Friendly, look at their depth chart, or you can just pull it up on YouTube. We've got it all here. So we're going to go line by line, but we kind of want to use player tiers, because for Ottawa, like on Ottawa's depth chart, it's Tkachuk, Stützle, Tarasenko, and then Giroux on the left side, Norris, and Batherson, which I think might be what they do ultimately. But we'll try and go with player tiers. So for the Panthers, their first line is considered to be on here: Carter Verhaeghe, Alex Barkov, and Matthew Tkachuk. So obviously, I think the best player of anybody on this list is Matthew Tkachuk. That guy is next level, and hopefully Brady can follow in his footsteps. But right now, Matthew is just a different beast, right? He's 25 years old, 109 points last season, 40 goals, and obviously was incredible in the playoffs. I mean, he was probably the biggest factor behind their ridiculous playoff run to the finals. He just carried them through everything, him and Bobrovsky a little bit there too. So I think obviously we can kind of, like, for the first line, I think Kachuk's got everybody beat, but then I think that Timmy's pretty, I mean, I don't want to say he's better than Barkov. Barkov's a great two-way player, but Timmy, they had the same point per game ratio, and I think that Tim is a little more dynamic, a little more explosive. He's better offensively, but they're fairly close in regards to talent. I think they'd all be in that top tier. I think everybody in regards to both first lines would be in that top tier, except for Verhaeghe, but at the same time, Verhaeghe scored 42 goals last year, so now I'm second-guessing myself. What do you think about the top tier for forwards? Is that going to be, for Ottawa, that should be Tim, Brady, Giroux, assuming Claude can kind of withstand what he did last season. And then that's probably it for their top tier, maybe Norris, but at the same time, I think he's too much of a question mark. And then for the Panthers, I think you've got Barkov and Kachuk at least, and then maybe Verhaeghe based on last year.
I like Verhaeghe a lot, to be honest. I think he had one. This might have been his third year in Florida, maybe second, but I know he had one really out of nowhere season, but he keeps scoring goals, and he was good in the playoffs too. Like, I like him a lot. So I gotta be honest. I know I'm a Sens fan, whatever, and I love the Sens top line. I think if this is a top line, because I don't think they all played like in the playoffs, they move things around with depth and everything. But when you're going depth chart, their three best forwards are these guys, and those are the Sens three best forwards probably. I think I'm taking Florida's. And honestly, if you go Kachuk versus Kachuk, Matthew right now, I'm taking him. Barkov is like, the thing is too, like, we're going in as it's next year, right? And maybe I take Giroux over Verhaeghe, but I think I take Barkov and Matthew Kachuk over Brady and Stützle. But we're younger, right? So if this is a 3-4 year question, I'm taking the Sens. It's just that these guys are proven now; they're in their middle of their prime. I have to take Matthew and Barkov. Now, that being said, it's close. It's closer than it was last year. I think both of those guys, Brady and Timmy, had unreal years last year. It's just going to be a question of if they can do it again. And I know that with Brady and Matthew, I think they've kind of followed the same trajectory, right? Matthew's played 2 more years in the league, and he's had back-to-back 100-point seasons. So if Brady goes out and puts up 100+ next year, which is, again, not out of the question, like, he keeps improving every year, we can't put it past him, then it's a discussion. Like, then is this the peak of Matthew Kachuk? And again, I think when you say peak, people think it has a negative connotation. Like, it's not a bad thing. His peak is a top 5 player in the NHL, so that's not nothing. But is this his peak? And if it is, then can Kachuk, like our Kachuk, reach that peak? That's a great question to ask, I think, and we'll find out obviously in the next 2 years. But right now, as it stands right now, I have to take Florida's top line over Ottawa's, and it's not even really a, Matthew Kachuk's on top. Then I got Stützle and Barkov in the same tier. Like, to me, I've got Matthew Kachuk, Barkov in like tier A or S tier, whatever you want to call it. Then below, I've got the rest. I've got, Kachuk, Stützle, Giroux, and then probably Verhaeghe right after that. Like, it's that tight, but I think the top end talent for Florida on that top line is pretty, it stands out a lot.
It does, yeah. Now I'm looking at some Panther fan projections because I think they're a little more accurate. Most of them have the consensus. Actually, all of them have their top line as being Verhaeghe, Barkov, and Evan Rodriguez, not Kachuk. Kachuk and Barkov don't play together, I don't think. I don't know why, but they don't seem to be a combo that they actually use. So in that case, I mean, that changes things. If you've got Evan Rodriguez, who was an unsigned free agent for quite some time, obviously had a good year last year, but he is certainly not a top line or even top 6 player. He's more of a third line guy. So if you remember the Panthers, one of their reasons for success was that they balanced everything out. They had Nick Cousins playing up their lineup. I just looked, a couple of fans even said like they have Cousins on their second line this year. Obviously Cousins, again, 9 goals, 27 points, 79 games. He's a fourth line forward pretty much, but they played him up, and that worked for them was they created that balance. So in regards to tiers, I think that is important just because this lineup probably isn't what they're going to actually roll in regards to combos. But yeah, it just has to be noted that still they have a lot of top end talent. But they probably won't actually end up playing together, which is kind of interesting. For the sake of this, we will use it just because that's easier, but just keep that in mind. So moving on to the second line, we've got on here Louis Durainen, Sam Bennett, and Sam Reinhart, which is a pretty impressive second line. I think they do like to roll Bennett with Kachuk based on what I'm seeing. But again, for this, like, it's a good second line, right? And Louis Durainen too. A lot of fans have Maki Samoskevich, who is a good prospect, pretty highly touted prospect on their second line this year, where Louis Durainen is, and then Louis Durainen on the third line. We'll see what happens in camp. He's not guaranteed a role as Samoskevich. So I think this second line, obviously, if we're comparing it to how do you want to? So you want to do Norris, Batherson, and Kubalik on the second line, or Giroux?
Let's do Tarasenko. Might as well.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we'll save Kubalik for the third one.
Yeah. So Tarasenko, Norris, and Batherson. Yeah. So that's such a good second line.
I know. Yeah, we're doing all right here, and this is why we're doing this exercise, right? I mean, this is I don't want to say the standard or whatever, but this is a team that found success in the playoffs, so stacking them up against each other is important. And look, I don't know if there will be any Panthers fans watching this, but we're trying our best here not to be totally Sens biased, and I think that is important when you do this exercise. Obviously, we're going to be favorable to our own guys, but I think every Sens fan will somewhat agree that the top line for the Panthers probably takes the cake, and I would say that the second line for the Sens takes the cake there. Now, there are some factors. Batherson has to bounce back in his overall game. He did have 62 points, which again would be, I believe it looks like Reinhart had 67 there, if I'm reading that correctly. So that's obviously the highest of any, the second, third lines. Yeah, there we go. That's a little, yeah, nice. Okay. So people watching on the YouTube again, it shows, their cap hit points from last year, whatever it is. Sam Bennett, 40 points in 63 games. That's not crazy. I think Norris outproduces that. I think Batherson did outproduce that. Like, stuff like that is important to consider as well. 31 goals for Sam Reinhart too. He had a pretty good year, actually. That's the thing. Like, do you value a guy like Sam Reinhart over Josh Norris? Like, if I were to make a trade 1-for-1 today, I guess you have to factor in the cap hit a little bit, but Reinhart's going into a contract year with $6.5 million left on his cap hit. Like, I might actually take Sam Reinhart over Josh Norris just based on that. But the other two, like the wingers, I'm taking, or I guess Reinhardt's a center, but I don't know. That's why the cap friendly is not great. He has him listed as a right wing here, but like, he did play center in the playoffs. I think he was on the third line or whatever it was. They had Barkov, Bennett, and Reinhart.
Most of their fans do have him on the wing, though.
Okay, so he's maybe better as a Giroux comparable. But anyway, my point is, I think in that group, I'm taking Norris over all three of those guys. But then I could see like, I'm all over the place, man. I'm taking Reinhart over Norris, but then I think the rest I'm taking the Sens. Like, I'm taking Norris over Bennett, I'm taking Batherson over Bennett, and I'm taking Tarasenko over Bennett. And then Luostarinen is a good player. Probably, I don't know if he's going to be a second line guy. Like, that's the thing. They seem to have a hole in their top six right now, right? It's kind of what the Sens were faced with before getting Tarasenko. Like, they have a hole where I'm not doubting that Luostarinen can't put up top six numbers when he's playing in the top six, but throughout the regular season, you do need to kind of establish a top six. Whereas Florida found success in the playoffs by staggering this and having a strong third line, which again is why we were not I don't want to say driving a narrative, but you and I both agreed that the Sens need a solid top nine that you can jumble around, which they now have. So based on this, though, I think the second line for the Sens, I'm taking over it. I don't know about you, but the Sens second line just sounds more like a first line to me. Like, that could pass as a first line on a team, whereas I don't think this one could for the Panthers.
No, and I think, there's a good comparable between Reinhart and Norris. Norris is also a bit younger and obviously has term, but he also has those health concerns. That's probably why I would take Reinhart, is because I'm scared that Norris is going to suffer through injuries through half of his contract, which would suck. But yeah, Reinhart is coming off of a good year. He's a great two-way player as well. Otherwise, though, I mean, I don't even think there's a conversation between, I would take Batherson and Tarasenko over Bennett and Luostarinen quite easily. I don't even think you need to even explain that. They're just better players. I expect them to do more. So I definitely think that Ottawa's second line as a whole, like you said, is kind of a first line. And yeah, you talked about holes in Florida's top six. Like I said, most of their fans are projecting Evan Rodriguez and Mackie Samoskevich to fill top six roles for them. Neither of those players are, or at least proven in Samoskevich's case. By the way, I'm impressed by my ability to say that name, because that is a hard name and I've gotten really good at it. Samoskevich.
You rattled that off really quickly too, like it was nothing.
Yeah. But I mean, having those guys in your top six, it kind of reminds me of Ottawa just plugging players in and hoping that they can fill a role offensively where they just haven't proven it in the past. So I know that, like I said, Florida kind of thrived on depth this year and balancing their lineup, but I think that could come back to bite them in this just lethal Eastern Conference. So I think we're kind of in the consensus. My only thing with being biased, maybe I'm just biased, but I'm so high on Tim Stützle in regards to a competition with any center in the league. I know NHL Network had him ranked 15th overall on their list for centers in the league, which I don't know if I'm assuming Barkov is probably higher than that, but I will almost go to war with Tim Stützle versus any center aside from McDavid and those top guys. But regardless, we'll wait to see what Timmy does this season. I think he's going to really solidify himself as a top 10 center and earn the respect he deserves. So regardless of that, we'll move to the third line here. So far, it's kind of Florida's top guys, maybe the top two guys, and then Ottawa's got just a wealth of guys who are then above the next tier of Panthers players is kind of the way. It's Barkov and Tkachuk, and then Ottawa's got Stützle, Tkachuk, Giroux, Norris, right? They've got all these guys, and then Florida's guys are kind of below that. Bennett, Reinhart could kind of be in that top tier as well, but it's close. So Florida's third line on here is listed as Evan Rodriguez, Anton Lundell and Grigory Denisenko. Denisenko is one of those unproven prospects as well. They expect him to make the team, but it's going to come down to training camp. That could also be Samoskevich. I mean, you look at this group and then you compare with Ottawa, who we're going to leave Matthew Joseph out of it again just because of the cap issues, right? I think he'll be a cap casualty, but if not, then we'll kind of factor him in. For Ottawa, then we will do Ridley Gregg, Shane Pinto, and Dominic Kubalik. And I have to say, I am so high on that line. Like, I am really high on Ottawa's third line. I think it's going to be hard pressed, and other fans will probably call it bias because they're not that high on Pinto and whatever, and Gregg's unproven. But I personally think that line will be one of the better third lines in the league or in the Eastern Conference. It's just like, assuming Gregg can fill a full-time role. Pinto he's a 20 goal scorer, but he's a really good two-way player. He was playing in a second line role that he shouldn't have been last year, and he thrives still. So I think he's going to be great on the third line. Kubalik, another 20 goal scorer who will probably produce more in Ottawa and especially on the power play. But like I said, I mean, if you look at Rodriguez, Lundell, and Denisenko versus Gregg, Pinto, and Kubalik, I think you have to take Ottawa's third line as a whole. But Rodriguez, again, if he's in that role, maybe you take him over Ridley Gregg. Personally, though, yeah, I'm going to be hard-pressed to ever say that Ottawa's third line is worse than most of these third lines if, in fact, Ridley Gregg is a full-time NHL player.
I like the way that this kind of stacks up. And yeah, we you mentioned Florida fans have had Evan Rodriguez in the top 6 or whatever, but I like it the way this is set up because it kind of, you can compare it to Ottawa's third line. And like I said, Ottawa's going to have the ability to jumble up the top 9 like they want. And Florida's probably going to do the same thing, but like in terms of depth and how they get paid and whatever, this makes sense. So I think you go Rodriguez versus Kubalik, you go Lundell versus Pinto, and Denisenko against Gregg. And I think that's fair because Denisenko's probably played the same amount of games as Gregg. It looks like, I don't know if that was the only 18 he's played, but similar, timeline. Like, it's a prospect who's going to be a rookie next year, I'm guessing, like Gregg will be. And I think that's a fair comparison. Rodriguez and Kubalik, I'm taking Kubalik because it just produces more. And I think Rodriguez has been on some pretty good teams as well, and Kubalik hasn't really. So you got to factor that in as well. The only question for me is Lundell versus Pinto, and I'm still taking Pinto, so I'm with you on that. But that's the only close one to me, right? I think that's fair to say that, like, Pinto outproduced him last year, but I don't know. I mean, like, that's not a bad stat line for Lundell. I like him a lot, actually. I think,
he's
ironically,
great defensively.
He's great defensively. The Sens had 3 picks in the 2020 draft, and I was hoping, and we were that it was the Islanders pick, that the Islanders wouldn't do so well in the bubble. Of course, they end up going to the Eastern Conference Final, so it ends up being pick 28, which is where they got Ridley Gregg. Again, thrilled with Gregg still, but Lundell was one of those guys I was hoping would fall into the mid-teens for the Sens kind of thing, if that's where their pick was. So I was, it's a great pick for Florida. I think he's a great player. So that's the only, debate, I guess, for me anyway, in that third line, but I'm still taking Pinto. Like, I'm very high on Shane Pinto as well. So I take Ottawa's third line. Now, let's do fourth line quickly. It's going to probably be a trend here because I'm going to guess that you're doing the same thing. I'm taking this over Ottawa's fourth line. I think just alone the fact that Nick Cousins had the ability to go play up and be successful on a second or first line or whatever he was, that's enough, literally, for me to say that this line's better. Ryan Lomberg is a dog. I think he's a great player too. I hate watching him play against the Sens because he's so effective at being a pest. And Steve Lorenz, I think, is maybe, I'm not really too familiar with him, but 10 goals. If that's on your fourth line, that's good. It's more than Ottawa had. Obviously, Austin Watson had 10 goals, but he's gone now, or probably will be. I don't think they'll sign him. So I'm taking Florida's fourth line over Ottawa's. So that kind of leaves it at 2-1. I take Florida's first line and their fourth line, but I take Ottawa's middle 6 over Florida's middle 6. So where do you stand on the fourth line?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think, like, opposite to the third line, I don't think I can really take Ottawa's fourth line over almost anybody, because right now their fourth line projects as Parker Kelly, who's on a one-way deal, Mark Kastelik, and Zach McEwen, which, again, we talked about this last time. It's just Kelly and McEwen, to me, they just aren't impactful enough. Like, I like the hits they throw. I think they'll be physical, but at this point, you need your fourth line to be able to at least produce a little bit. And I love Kastelik for what it's worth. I think he's a great fourth line player. Also had like close to 60% on faceoffs, which is awesome, and he's a good penalty killer. But Kelly and McEwen, to me, they just aren't those guys right now. They should be extra forwards. I'm hoping they can find a way to keep Joseph and he could play there or in the middle 6. But for now, I mean, based on what we know, I'm just not high enough on those guys. If Crookshank is there, it could be a different discussion, but again, he's just unproven, and you can't take that over like a Ryan Lomberg, right? So I definitely like Florida's fourth line, but like you said, I'm high on Ottawa's middle six compared to that. I think their third line, I know Lundell's good, but it's a bit of a question mark. We can go back to, like, if you forget about the cap friendly for a minute, a lot of their fans have their lineup projected like this for forwards. So first line, Rodriguez, Barkov, and Verhaeghe. And then second line, Samoskevich, Bennett, Tkachuk. Third line, Louis Drinen, Lundell, Reinhart. Fourth line, Cousins, Lawrence, and Lomberg. So again, it's a lot of names to remember, and it's fine if that's just like blabble, but that's kind of the way that it projects. And I think as a whole, the Panthers have probably the best two players, or at least the best player right now among both teams. But then Ottawa has a lot more depth in regards to power, like star power. I think that's a good way to put it, because I would certainly take Stützle, Tkachuk, Batherson, Norris, those guys over the Panthers group after Matthew Tkachuk. Like that's kind of my take on it. So as a whole, I'm leaning Ottawa, but I am also biased, and I'll probably be leaning Ottawa in a lot of these situations. So I can at least admit that. Again, I think like oh my God, I'm blanking. Like Buffalo, who we did last time, I think this is a very close group. I think they are comparable. I think both teams will be competing for a spot, and it would be silly for either fan base to say, yeah, this team's way ahead of the other one. That's not the point of this, and if either fan base is saying that, it's clear bias, because I think they are close in regards to where they are for forwards.
So for forwards, that is the case, yeah, and it's very similar to Buffalo. You're right. I think this is tighter than I thought. Honestly, again, like more than I thought. This is why we're doing this. It's good perspective on depth charts and teams that they're going to be competing against for playoff spots next year. Let's go to the defense. And before we even mention anything, for those watching on the YouTube, the Cap Friendly page does not have Aaron Ekblad, and it does not have Brendan Montour because of injuries that they suffered in the playoffs. So they are on the injured reserve. You can see right there is Brendan circling. So I don't know how long they're going to be out, but for the sake of this, exercise, like we did with Jack Quinn in Buffalo, we're going to assume that they're not on the roster right now, and just assume that this is what they're going in with, because both are going to be missing time this season. And with that in mind, this decor is not good. This is not a good decor, and that's why I think Ottawa is a better team overall. But we'll get to all that after. So right now, like let's just rip through all of this, because it's not even a question. And I know maybe there's a Panthers fan watching, and I'm kind of underselling maybe who's going to see this, but if this is going to be clips for Twitter, the Sens blue line is miles better than this on paper. Now, with Ekblad and Montour, that changes things for sure, but as it stands in September and October, the Sens are better. And even with Ekblad and Montour, I would make the argument that the Sens are probably better off. But now it's got Forsling, Mahura as their top pairing, then Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Dmitry Kulikov is the second pairing, which I cannot see working out. And then Mikkola and Matt Kiersted as their third pairing. Looks like they got Mike Riley as a scratch too. Like, I don't know, man. Nothing on that page screams to me that anyone on that list is better than anyone on the Sens. Like, Forsling was good. He had a great year last year. I think he was impressive offensively. But yeah, that's where the Panthers are going to struggle, I think. And we talked about it with Boston last summer, because they had injuries to their core. McAvoy missed time early on, so did Marchand, but obviously the Bruins just wouldn't lose a game because they were really well run and well coached and whatever. But I think this is different, because it's two members, it's your two best defensemen. It's not just two random, players in different positions that you can supplement. It's two guys on the blue line, which is a big hit. So I'm taking the Sens every single player over these guys, and I don't know about you.
Yeah, I certainly am as well. I'm not high on that group at all. I was just looking up the injury status of Montour and Ekblad. So Ekblad, it says, will miss the start of training camp, and he had to have shoulder surgery. He's probably going to miss, I don't know how many games during the season, but I would assume he will not play at the start again. Montour as well is expected. He just had shoulder surgery, I believe, and he's expected to miss 4 to 6 months. So he might get back on the ice in September. If we're being optimistic, he might start the season, but it sounds like he's probably going to miss at least the first 10, 20 games, which can be the difference in making the playoffs, obviously, if they're rolling this defense for 10 or 20 games, right? So Ottawa's group, again, we talked about it. It's going to probably be Shabbat, Chikrin on the top pairing, and then Sanderson, Zub on the second pairing, Brandstrom, Hamonic, or Bernard Docker. I think all three pairings, like you said, are well above what you're seeing here. Forsling has kind of broken out to be a pretty good player, but otherwise, Ekman-Larsson has fallen off of the biggest cliff in history. Like, this is just not a not a good group of six. But again, we will make sure to say, because the Panthers fans would get in the comments, we'll make sure to say that Ekblad and Montour will play this season. They're just probably going to miss at least the first portion of it, which can be a big deal. So yeah, I don't even think we need to spend too much time on that, because unlike Buffalo, where they had Darlene and Power, and it was a big debate, I even posted that. I'll probably do the same thing with this, made the little post with the lineups, and Buffalo fans, I used their hashtag just to get that engagement, and they came in and they were angry. I don't even know what about. Like, the other fan bases always assume that as a Sens page, I'm completely like biased and totally favoring Ottawa, but in reality, like Buffalo's very close, Florida's very close. I think Florida, if Ekblad and Montour were on this list for the full season, would be pretty close to Ottawa in regards to defense, but I still would take Ottawa's group, even with those two in, just because I think Ottawa, like, it's going to be a hard defense to beat. I keep saying that they're not going to get the respect till they earn it and they prove something on the ice, but on paper, which is really all we can evaluate at this moment, because we haven't seen much of Chychrun yet and stuff, I think that Ottawa's group matches up against most defense corps in the league. Like, that's just kind of my take on it, but we can move to goalies here if you've got nothing else on defense. So obviously the Panthers signed Sergei Bobrovsky to that monster $10 million a year contract. Was that for 8 years too? Like, that's so insane that they signed him to this mega deal, like $80 million.
For 7 years or something.
Yeah. And he lost his role. The crazy thing about their playoff run this year was that Alex Lyon, who they didn't even keep, like, I don't even know where he went. He signed some like two-way deal. He went on this miraculous Hamburglar run where he just pushed them to the playoffs, and they went on this huge stretch, because Ottawa and Florida were even at one point late in the season. Like, I thought Ottawa was definitely going to finish above them. I remember Ottawa played them, and I think they whooped them in a game late in the season, and I remember thinking, man, this Panthers team is bad. Like, right, I was maintaining that right to the playoffs when they made it. I was like, you guys are going to get absolutely whooped in the first round. Like, you're going to be out of here. Because they looked terrible when Ottawa played them. And then Alex Lyon kind of carried them to victory. And then he lost his role in the playoffs after his Hamburglar run. And then Bobrovsky took over, and he had this big stretch. So it was a lot of things going right for the Panthers in regards to their goaltending. I think that's kind of how they got hot. Spencer Knight as well, who was a first-round pick a few years ago, 2019, I want to say. He was on the player assistance program, and hopefully he's doing better. He's only 22. It's really did suck to see that when that happened, and kind of made you a little bit emotional for the guy, but he's back, I think, so he's expected to be the backup now with Bobrovsky, which on paper, very nice tandem. We don't know what Knight's going to be like. He could be, he hasn't played in a while, so he could be up and down, but Bobrovsky, if he can do anything like he did in the playoffs again, I think they're going to be in a pretty nice spot, because he is a very, like, one of the league's best goaltenders when he's on his game, but it's about consistency. So what do you think about Ottawa's goalies as a comparison, since I kind of just touched on Florida's? How do they stack up?
This is where I think it might be the biggest question mark, and it is an on-paper thing. So if you look, and obviously on the YouTube again, the stats for the goalies last year, they got 71 games total out of Knight and Bobrovsky combined, and their numbers aren't much better than what Forsberg and Talbot gave the Sens, which is kind of funny. And then you mentioned Alex Lyon, who played the other 10 games, 8 games, whatever it was. Quick math for Jack there. That is a factor in the sense that he's the reason they made the playoffs. Now, Bobrovsky took over in the playoffs and was absolutely dynamite. He looked like the best goalie in the NHL. It's just a question of, can they do it in the regular season? Because, yeah, it's a good tandem on paper. It's also an expensive tandem on paper. The Sens goalies are costing them $6.75 million. The Panthers are spending $14.5 on a tandem. It's a big difference. It's almost an entire, it's almost double of a difference, right? More even. So, again, I got to stop doing the math with the numbers because I'm putting myself in a pretzel. But the thing is, like, Korpisalo is probably the biggest question mark, in the sense that he had a good year last year. Obviously, his stats compared to Bobrovsky and Knight's were much better during the regular season. But it's, can he do that again? Because you mentioned, and like we're talking about the cap hit for Bobrovsky, but when he plays like he did in the playoffs, he's absolutely worth that. So it makes sense. The thing with the Panthers, though, and this is the whole team overall, they are older than the Sens are. Not that they're an old team, but you look, they signed Ekman Larson, they get Kulikov. 2 defensemen that are 32 years old. They've got Barkov, who's pushing 30. I think he's 27, 28 years old. Kachuk's 25, which is good, but like Bobrovsky's 34. So again, I know it's just for next season, but you have to factor that in, that they played until June. Like, they had a long year, and typically it takes teams a long time to get the engine going again when they've just made the finals, right? Like, there's always that. I mean, they call it the Stanley Cup hangover, but they didn't win the cup, obviously, but they they struggled, or sorry, they played a lot of hockey down the stretch, and with the injuries and whatever, we didn't even mention that Kachuk was also very injured as well. Like, you don't know how he's going to bounce back. So there's a lot of factors. So my point is, a 34-year-old goalie in Sergei Bobrovsky playing the way he did, playing as much as he did in the playoffs, I think that could take a toll on their season next year, and he's going to be the biggest question mark because for years, for pretty much the length of his contract, he's been a liability for the Panthers. Like, they haven't been able to play him, so much so that he didn't start game one of the playoffs, right? He took over for Alex Lyon against the Bruins. And then Spencer Knight's also a question mark. So I'm going to take Ottawa's tandem over the Panthers, even though Korpisalo is still a question mark, because I think Bobrovsky is a bigger question mark. And if it's just a yes or no question, are they going to be good? You got to take Bobrovsky obviously over any goalie the Sens have, but it's still a question. And depending how it's answered, I'm taking Ottawa's just because Knight's also a question mark, I guess. But then you could also say the Forsberg's also a question mark. So like both teams actually have stability in net, yeah, but they're both question marks on both of their goalies, which is kind of funny. Maybe there aren't many teams that know what they have going in terms of what their goalie is going to give them, but that's kind of the game, right? It all comes down to goaltending. So I am going to take Ottawa's just because Bobrovsky hasn't had a full regular season in Florida where he's been a star like he was in the playoffs, and I think that's fair. I think I'm suggesting also that if he is a star, then he's obviously the best goalie of either team, probably one of the best in the league. So it's not even a conversation, but it's too big of a question mark for me to commit to that right now.
Yeah, it is. And I just want to also say that Korpisalo was by far the best goalie among this group last year. I think he had a 915 save percentage. And like I said last time, by the numbers, he was the 12th best goalie in the league. That's by save percentage and goals saved above expected, which are fairly accurate. Like they're good ways to evaluate a netminder. And he did even better. I think he had a 921 save percentage when he got to LA. So again, didn't do great in the playoffs against that Edmonton team. But when you compare him to Bobrovsky, who did not have a good year at all last year, and again lost his role to Alex Lyon, or he might have been hurt, but I think he just lost his role. Like, he was the backup for Lyon. He just wasn't playing well enough. And I just went back and looked at Bobrovsky, and he's only had one season since coming to Florida and signing that deal where he was above .910 for save percentage. It was 913 last year. Before that, it was 906 and 900 in his first 2 years. So he hasn't been like this elite netminder. He did so well in the playoffs, and yeah, go for it.
Sorry, so not last year he was 913?
Yeah.
And they won the President's trophies.
Yeah.
So like that's all you need to know. If he has a good year, this team is legit, right? I think that's fair. They added Kachuk. They're a better hockey team than they were when they won the President's Trophy, I think. But they just need Bobrovsky to be Bobrovsky. So if you're a Panthers fan, you should expect that because you just saw it in the playoffs. So I'm really curious. I think that's a huge. We talk about this. We should call this the X Factor podcast because I keep saying it. This is the X Factor. So yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but the goaltending is a question mark for both teams in a really strange way.
It is, yeah. But Bobrovsky, like, they signed into that deal because in Columbus, the 3 years before he got sent to Florida, or he signed in Florida, he was 913, 921, and 931. Like, he was very good those 3 years before coming to Florida. Again, it just, like, this year he played 50. Last year he played 54 games, and again was pretty good. But this past year, Korpisalo was by far better than any goaltender on this list. So I think we have to factor that in. Korpisalo, like, the thing I'm so intrigued about him is that his numbers the past 2 years before this one that just happened were terrible. Like, it was below 9.0 save percentage. He was in the 8.9 and 8.97. Like, it just wasn't good. But at the same time, those Columbus teams were terrible, like really bad. So when you put a goalie in a better situation, and we talked about it, Columbus had one of the worst records in the league, and Korpisalo was actually 11-11 and 3, like, on a terrible team. I'm so excited to see what he can do on a better team with a better defense. And I'm hoping that wasn't just a one-year wonder type of thing, and that's what we're all hoping. Because if he can be average, like we talked about, I think that's all Ottawa needs. But yeah, I mean, on the goalies, I would take Ottawa's group based on this past season. If Bobrovsky can live up to his potential, he'll by far be the best goalie on this list. But right now, and based on what we've seen over the last 4 years, except for these past playoffs, he's just hasn't been that guy, right? So for now, and his age obviously is also 34, he's just not. You can't expect Bobrovsky to bounce back at this point. That's not fair to say. Whereas Korpisalo, being 30, I think that there's a better chance he kind of continues his play from last season. So Ottawa's goalies for sure. I think Ottawa's defense for sure, even with Ekblad and Montour. involved. And then the forwards are kind of they're the closest part of this whole discussion for sure. But I think as a whole, like, do you project the Panthers as a playoff team next year?
I'm gonna say no. And again, that's not because I don't think they're a playoff team. Like I said before, they're with the Karlsson trade. There's now 12, 11 teams that have a legit claim to say I'm a playoff team or trying to make the playoffs. So I would consider them one of those. But I really do think that with the drop off from the finals, like injuries and stuff like that, I would be so surprised if this is a team that pushes for top three in the Atlantic. They might be able to get some late season magic going like they did this year, but yeah, to me, I don't see them. I don't see them making the playoffs. I see them as one of the teams falling out. Which again, obviously the Sens kind of need to happen. Someone's got to fall out for them to make it, and it makes sense to be the team that came eighth last year. So again, like we did this with Buffalo. Like I feel enlightened. I feel more confident in the Sens, but also more confident in their holes, right? And like we know their fourth line needs to be good. I don't want to say ifs and question marks for their forwards, but on paper, this is a playoff team. Again, I'm going to keep saying it. We just compared them to the Florida Panthers, who made the playoffs, and the Buffalo Sabres, who were 1 point out. Those are the two best. We should probably honestly just do the Penguins next time because they were the next team up. And then I think it was the Sens. I think it went Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Ottawa in terms of who missed the playoffs last year in the East. So that's what we're going to wrap up with on episode 30 here. We ended up stretching for a long time, which is great, with that Karlsson stuff that we forgot to mention off the top. So thanks everyone for watching. Please subscribe to the YouTube page. We are on the road to 1,000. I think we're going to get there by training camp. Don't have a date in mind, just training camp. Sends report. We see videos of the players getting to the city. That's when we want to hit 1,000 subscribers. It goes a long way. Brennan mentioned a members podcast we're going to do tomorrow. First half-ish of that will be available to the public. The rest will be available to people who subscribe to everydaysens.com for in-depth analysis and coverage of the Ottawa Senators. So thank you everyone for joining, and we will see you all next time.